Hello, my friends. Welcome to EdTech with Adam. It's great to see you all. Today, I'm very excited. We have this wonderful guest, Dr. Nigel Newbutt from the United Kingdom, out here today to talk with us about virtual reality approaches to autism and how we can help children and adults with autism using this new technology in a really amazing way. So, without further ado, I'd love to introduce Dr. Nigel Newbutt. Thank you for joining us.
Thank, thank you for having me. I really appreciate the invitation to come on. And as you said, I'm from the United Kingdom. I'm from the city of Bristol, where I'm a senior lecturer at the University of the West of England. And for the last 10 years or so, I've been exploring the potential and the opportunities of technologies for autistic individuals. And my work started in classrooms. I'm working with technology like virtual worlds. And it's kind of diversified as technology is diversified into using more sort of virtual reality head-mounted displays, which is something I'm going to talk a bit about as we go through this. So I've got a few slides here if that helps us to sort of contextualize what I'm talking about. And technology, broadly speaking, is in terms of being used with autistic populations. And I will just explain briefly, if it's okay for your viewers, listeners, that I'll go between using the word autistic and autism, if that's okay. So, it's generally accepted that there's no right or wrong way, but, some people prefer autistic and some people prefer autism. So I will go between that language. But research in the area of autism and technology is something that's been ongoing since the mid 1970s. And as you would imagine, that involved, multimedia devices and those types of technologies. And as we move through the 70s into the 80s and 90s, we started to see things like virtual reality head-mounted displays being used. And then obviously as other technologies such as iPads and touchscreen devices and robots have become available, and we've seen research develop in those areas as well. So it's nothing too new per se, but I think, as I said, some of the newer technologies are something that we've become particularly excited about for a range of reasons that I'll come on to. Mm-hmm. So like I say, technology and research in this area has covered everything from virtual worlds to things like Minecraft, things like PECs, so simple communication systems you can see on the top right here, right the way through to very specific designed interfaces for the iPad to help people with things like joint attention and communication, and then to the other end of the spectrum using devices such as robots. And the initial stages of virtual reality, which is something I'm going to focus on in the work that I've been doing. I mean, this is something, again, that's been around since mid-2000s, really. And you can see the sort of simple graphics that were experimented within the early days. And I'll jump right the way through to one of the first sort of studies that was done using head-mounted displays, which is something I'm sure you're familiar with. And this is Dorothy Strickland and colleagues experimented with with this head-mounted display, similar to the Oculus Rift now, I guess. And as you can see, it's a very large device. It's got a heavy cable and it's connected to a range of very powerful, expensive computers in a research lab. And as you can see here, again, some examples of the type of interfaces that the users with autism would have been presented with. And here they were wanting to understand whether or not the autistic children would be willing to wear this head-mounted display, and then whether it could be used in this case to help these individuals cross a road safely, so learn road safety skills. So that's where the sort of research has kind of gone on from, like I say, the 70s and the 80s with multimedia interfaces through to this much more sort of immersive technologies in the 90s. But then we didn't really see any more studies in this area until sort of 2015-16, which are sort of, these are two of the sort of first studies since then to really assess the potential of head-mounted displays with autistic populations. And it occurred to me when I was one of the authors sort of designing this piece of work, it really sort of stood out to me that people with autism have a range of different concerns and issues. And one of them is around sort of physically wearing stuff, and certainly wearing stuff around the head and the face, around the ears and stuff can be very challenging for some of these groups. So it occurred to me that the first thing we need to do is ask the population about whether or not they'd be willing to wear some of these devices and how acceptable these devices might be to these populations, because it wouldn't be very fruitful in developing a research agenda around this if we didn't start at that point. So that's what we wanted to do, really. We wanted to ask some questions around willingness to wear the headset and how they experience that headset, and whether or not, at the time in 2015-16, there was some questions around cyber sickness that were coming out around some of these headsets. And we wanted to really ask some questions around, would you feel comfortable in this space? Do you have any adverse or negative effects associated with them? So again, we also saw that these devices had moved on from these very lab-based, heavy cable devices to these very portable devices that you can see here demonstrated, just connected to a laptop, a very thin cable, as with this device, the Oculus SDK2. And of course, since then, we have wireless devices that that we're now using. But this was a very portable device, and we took it over to the States, and we did some studies with a range of different autistic adults, so 17 to 50-year-olds, for various ethical reasons. And we wanted just to explore how they would respond to a range of interfaces. And sort of as a headline, what we found was that there was willingness to wear the head-mounted display equipment. There was an ability to input to basic navigational sort of context, and as you can see in this picture here, using it was an Xbox 360 controller that they were used to navigate the space, and we found that they were able to do that. There was some interesting bodily interactions and responses to the virtual environment, so things like standing up to get a different perspective of something. And most importantly, we found that there were sort of high levels of presence and immersion reported from these individuals. And even more importantly, that there were low negative effects. So we didn't find any sort of cyber sickness concerns with the groups that we worked with. We also found that anxiety wasn't increased as a response to using this particular interface. So we started to lay to bed, I guess, some of the issues around sort of negative connotations that were associated with these devices. And also, we worked with populations who potentially would be using and getting some benefit from these devices, and sort of concluded that there was a general sense of comfort, and that gave us confidence to move ahead with another study with younger groups. So then the question kind of comes about, so if head-mounted displays are acceptable and there is a willingness to use these technologies by autistic people, how and where can they then be used? And one of the sort of premises is that using them in educational contexts and using them as an educational technology could, as it says here, ensure sustainability of these types of technologies. But also there was a criticism in the field premised by Sarah Parson in 2011 that one of the criticisms is that there's been a lack of involvement from practitioners in research on the educational approaches for autistic populations. So again, bridging this research to practice gap was still quite wide. So what we wanted to do next was take a range of different technologies into a school. And here you can see the three technologies that I'm talking about, a Google Cardboard or a cardboard-based device, a HTC Vive, and something called Class VR, which is a kind of a similar to the Oculus in some sense, in that it's an inbuilt device, but it only displays 360 videos, so fairly limited on the other hand. And we just wanted to explore with much younger populations, so 6 to 16-year-olds in this case, in a school with teachers, and again with autistic populations, to understand how this technology might be viable and usable in that particular context. So it's that kind of addressing that so what question, so what can we do with this? And again, we wanted to place the users sort of central to this, and we wanted to make sure that the populations we want to work with, that we could learn from, and the teachers who would potentially be deploying this technology were able and willing to do so and saw the advantages of doing that. So here's just some sort of examples of some of these groups using this technology in practice and in situ. And it's worth pointing out, again, at this point, we were using a cabled device. And since then, we have things like the Oculus Quest, which don't have cables and which provide another level of viability of using these technologies in classrooms. Because one of the issues that came up, of course, was around health and safety, and having wires and cables in classrooms can be fairly limiting. So this just gives some, like I say, some nice sort of examples of some of these populations and groups using these technologies. And I'm aware this is probably probably the playback isn't as smooth as it could be, but this just gives you a sense, this is an autistic individual, playing with a funfair environment, developing motor skills and using his motor skills and working through a range of different activities in a off-the-shelf piece of software. I'm flying through these, so do stop me if there's anything you think of particular importance. But what was really important about this study is we did work with, like I say, quite young populations. And so we had to develop a really rigorous and detailed sort of ethical and health and safety set of protocols. So working with young 6, 7, 8-year-old autistic individuals, some with language difficulties, provided quite a range of ethical sort of dilemmas that we had to really work hard to address. And we did that working with parents and working with their teachers, and just making sure we really staged their exposure to the technology in a very sort of small way to start with, before we all felt that they felt comfortable using that technology. And that was really important. Another important finding was that we found that actually the most immersive technologies, so the HTC Vive, again, similar to the Oculus before that and the Oculus Quest now, but that, being the most immersive and technologically sort of complex device, was what they found to be most rewarding for them as an experience, and something they wanted to work with and use again. The Class VR device, they didn't find quite so positive. They didn't have quite such a positive experience with, listing that as the least most preferable. But the Google Cardboards, didn't sit somewhere in the middle. It was still quite far down, but that was not the least most preferred and not the most preferred, but it was somewhere kind of in the middle there. And actually, the teachers reported the cardboard device as offering the most potential for them in their classrooms, which is something I'll come on to next in terms of how we've explored that further. I would say the third most important finding from that study, other than, again, we found no negative effects associated with using this technology with this population. Nobody didn't want to use it. Nobody wanted to stop using it, and nobody reported any adverse effects, headaches, eye strains, or anything like that. But equally, we also asked the autistic groups, what they wanted to use this technology for in their lives and in their school sort of educational context. And they actually said that it made them feel calm and relaxed, that they did feel they could connect it with learning opportunities, and that they could go places virtually to see what they look like before going there in the real world. So we started to locate some really important things, I think, for how we might take these technologies forward. What that then led us to do was we started to think about, okay, so the calming context and the visiting somewhere. During a science week at the school, they were due to visit a science museum in Bristol. And so we thought, okay, so why not let's connect the dots and actually create a 360 virtual tour that they could use with the Google Cardboard, or they could load it via YouTube in an Oculus or an HTC device. But we used the cardboard devices with a smartphone. And we actually created this 360 tour in collaboration with a local company in Bristol. And what the students were able to do is actually virtually visit this place in the comfort of the classrooms, in the safety of knowing that they're not actually there, but they could actually walk through where they were going to go, what they would see, what it would look like. And that really helped them prepare for the visit before going there. But then when they visited in the real world, they felt a bit more prepared in terms of what they were going to see and in what order and how. Because I think this really brings us back to what the key affordances of this technology are. I'm just going to jump back to a slide here. But really, this jumps back to what technology really holds for autistic people, is that they can often be predictable and controllable environments, that they're not always socially complex and, in fact, strip out certain complexities. That means that they can be less worrying and stressful for some people, and they can actually be a place to test and remove the stresses associated with real-life consequences. And they often involve just a one-on interaction, or they actually involve the user going into their own world and actually just being present in that space, which again can be very appealing for autistic groups. So there's something that, like I say, connecting all these dots up, we started to see with that example of the 360 tour at the Science Museum being really beneficial for helping the autistic children go somewhere virtually before going there in the real world, and having all the added stresses that can sometimes bring with the anxiety coupled with the autistic condition.
One thing that I noticed about Florio was that you'd have these opportunities to bring in these social situations, but something that I noticed that they didn't have, and something that just based on what you've told me so far would be kind of interesting, is there a way, because you're saying in these virtual reality experiences, the value in them is that you could completely remove all of the sources of social anxiety within them. Has any work been done into possibly being able to add parts that would introduce some social anxiety, but in a limited amount? So for example, you could add one person into the room, or you could add perhaps a challenge that would make it, and be able to scale that at all. Is that something that's being done right now as well to help with this predictability?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that's the kind of the key, really. I think you're right. One of the key advantages and affordances of these technologies is, as you rightly say, we can add additional layers in a way that can either somebody can very easily cope with a lot of people in an environment, or they can't, and we can tailor the environment to meet those needs. And if we wanted to, we could slowly increase that, increase the stimuli. And that work is mainly being done with people who have sort of schizophrenia and paranoid delusion. There's a lot of work being done there. And one of the apps that we actually used, there was a screenshot of it down here. This app in the bottom left here is, what this actually does is, this lady sat opposite you in a coffee shop. The more you look at her, the more she looks back at you. The less you look at her, the less she looks at you. So there's obviously some inbuilt sort of eye tracking going on. And there's another scene that you can go on like on a subway train or a tube train. And again, the more you look at people, the more they look at you, and that can be quite disconcerting. And we found some autistic people in that environment were more interested in looking at the bookshelf that was behind them than actually the person sat across them, because they found it quite weird and strange for somebody to be maintaining eye contact. So you're right, in that, I think there's definitely the opportunity to start bringing in things like artificial intelligence and giving the user a staged experience that can slowly but surely increase the stimuli and make them feel more comfortable, if that's something of interest. And that's something that we still yet don't know. Exactly how these technologies can be most suitably deployed. It could be for adhering to social conventions. It could be to understanding social communication. It could be just to learning. We're currently exploring with the school now, creating some virtual reality opportunities around doing a job interview. So we're looking towards environments that can sometimes provide quite stressful contexts. So a job interview for any of us can be quite stressful and difficult. And we know that people with autism are woefully underrepresented in the employment market. So, in the UK, 13% of people with autism are in full-time employment, and it's shocking. And one of the reasons for that was because of some of the barriers we're putting in their way, like having to do a stressful job interview. So we're looking at ways of how virtual reality can help provide not a way to, I suppose a way to test and a way to walk through what that feels like and what it can be like. And as you say, put curveballs in there. So what happens if a fire alarm goes off halfway through? How would you cope with that? So we're looking at things that we can do like that. But how exactly, or what exactly that looks like, and who we do that with, and by that I mean, who are we collaborating with? So that's a collaboration with the teachers, because they see a particular need for that. So I think it's having the right conversations with the right people to identify what the next steps are in this space are really important, actually. I'm just wondering if I've got the only other thing I was going to sort of highlight here in terms of visual stuff is, from that piece of work, we then did put together a document with the National Autistic Society over here in the UK, and they have a research arm called Network Autism. And with that work we did at the school, we wanted to provide some advice and guidance for teachers who might want to explore this technology in their schools. And this is a document that I can obviously provide you a link to. But really what this does is start to articulate what some of our research has found and how that sort of translates into an actual classroom, and actually teachers being able to use some of this stuff, because we did identify some of the barriers with using this technology. Teachers didn't always feel very comfortable sort of setting this technology up and using it. They felt it was quite challenging in some ways. So what we did here was suggested that the Google Cardboard was a good middle ground. And we actually provided some guidance around how to get that set up, and almost just like a step-by-step, how to get that set up. And then we provided some examples of different software that they could download onto a smart device and start using in classrooms and connecting with curriculum. And since then, we've worked with a school who have actually put together a strategic document using Oculus Quest, and how we've identified a range of programs that can be used and connect with curriculum in meaningful ways. So that's another document, again, I can perhaps provide you with, because at the moment there is still quite a gap between the research and the sort of blue skyness of some of this and the actual application in classrooms being delivered by teachers. And that's something we're really still working with. So I wouldn't want to offer any solutions at this point, or even suggest that researchers at that point. But these sort of directions and documents that we're putting together kind of start to lean towards that. And really importantly, these documents also contain, considerations of using these technologies with these populations. What things should teachers be aware of related to, the adverse effects that could be experienced, the physical space you need to set up, the supervision that's provided, and what to do if they do feel any negative effects from these. So we're starting to provide some guidance, because teachers need guidance and they also need reassurance that this should work, but at the same time there are things to be aware of, and how do I navigate those things should they arise. So we're starting to provide some of that guidance now.
Yeah, and I can put a link to this on in the video description below as well, so people can just check that out and go straight to it.
That's really cool, yeah, because I think that, as I said, is a real, and the work that others are doing, as you mentioned, Florio and others, you know, I know they're working very closely with schools and various districts, and, you know, that is the way to see this stuff really, because, you know, if this stuff is to benefit, you know, autistic people and their, you know, and their stakeholder groups broadly speaking, we've got to put it in their hands, haven't we? We've got to give it to those, put it into those spaces where it can be beneficial. But like I say, the evidence is still fairly scattered around the benefits, you know, that it can bring. And in fact, one of the other things that we did do was we did also put together, the school that I've worked with is quite fortunate in that it has a coffee shop attached to it. I don't know what things are like in Canada in terms of having what the schools are like there, but they have a coffee shop. And one of the reasons for that is to help the post-16 students who are going to be transitioning to employment actually work in that coffee shop and to simulate a real work environment. So one of the things we did was we experimented with this was a head-mounted display version of a coffee shop. And here the students were able to actually work through what the procedures and the processes were to making a coffee in the virtual space. You can see, you know, they're just in their classroom, they're doing it virtually. And the idea is, you know, the premise is that what's happening in this space, because it feels so realistic and the ecological validity is reported as being very high, that the learning sort of undergoing in the, you know, taking place in these spaces can very much be transferred to the real world. And again, that idea of removing, so you don't have a bunch of customers waiting for you. You're making mistakes, stuff's going wrong, people aren't shouting at you, you know, those sort of things aren't happening. So the idea in this space is that that's where the skills can be developed, and things can go wrong, but eventually things go right. And then eventually, you know, these individuals transition into the real life coffee shop. You can see an example of it there being played. So, you know, we find this idea of rehearsing, testing, simulating being very beneficial to the education of these individuals. So I hope that helps sort of visualize and contextualize some of the work ongoing.
And how is it really going in terms of development? Like I feel like a lot of this is, of course, it's specially created for autistic people, but on the other hand, there's a lot that's being used that just already exists. And is there some special feature within, or a feature set within an application that makes it ideal for autistic people, or does there need to be like some extra thing, like an ability, like in Florio, for a supervisor or someone to be able to intervene?
Yeah, I very much think so. I think all those points are a fair sort of evaluation and assessment of the space. A lot of the work I've been doing has been using off-the-shelf device, you know, off-the-shelf software. For one reason, I think it's affordable and it's easily accessible often. So if we do find some benefit with it, we can quickly and easily distribute it. But there is a much more urgent need to develop very bespoke solutions, I think. And I think you're right. The sort of work that Florio is doing, where there is somebody who can control and can see what's happening on a mirrored screen, I think that's really important. But again, you know, rolling that out mainstream or rolling that out across a bigger range of people could have its challenges, I would imagine. So I think, yeah, there's loads of questions really that we still need to be asking. But like I say, we need to be asking them with the people that we're seeking to serve, and the teachers, you know, seeking to provide an improved, educational, environment for them, you know, in some cases. But yeah, so I don't know if that answers the question, but I think it really just sort of endorses what you've said, in that there is a need for that. And as I said, this research has only been going on for the last 4 or 5 years, so it's still fairly early, I think. And the evidence that is coming out from this work now, while being very positive and being very, supporting the uniqueness and the affordances that this technology can offer some of these groups, you know, there's not enough of it yet to really provide us with the answers to the questions that you're asking, and so much more needs to be done. And it's really great that some really innovative companies, industries, researchers are doing this, but you know, there is a need to really sort of spearhead this this route into sort of practice, which is a challenge that I think researchers face in this field.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of the headsets, like you had a slide earlier where you comparing Google Cardboard and HTC Vive and all of these other ones, and you're mentioning the HTC Vive was very popular. Was it because of the quality of the graphics that it was popular, or was it because you were mentioning earlier that Class VR is mostly only used for things like just 360 VR tours and stuff, whereas the HTC Vive has all these capabilities for games and stuff? Was that what, so was it about quality, or was it about like the accessibility to or availability of games and things like that?
I think it would be remiss of me not to suggest there was something exciting about the more sort of edutainment, sort of gamified context that I think the HTC brings. But that said, I think there was something more about I think you feel more present in those spaces. You can move, it responds to where you're moving. There's an ability to have an input through the controllers that you're holding. So I think it offered just a bit more interactivity, actually. We found that as you say, with the Class VR, people were sat down and I think they got quite bored, I would say, quite quickly maybe in that space. Even with the Google Cardboard, there is a way to interface with that, isn't there? There's the wee button on the top right-hand corner there. You can actually press and it actually does something. It actually interfaces in some way. So I think we found that ability to interface in quite detailed, interesting ways really stimulated the groups that we worked with. And I think that certainly provides, but I would also provide a sort of not a warning, but a caveat that we didn't explore all the potential of any of these devices. So the Class VR interfaces we used, were fairly basic. And likewise, we used some sort of off-the-shelf software with the HTC and the Google Cardboard or apps on the smartphone. So we didn't explore everything that they offered. And if we were to have done that, maybe we may have found something slightly different. But there was definitely something about the level of immersion and the sense that people really felt like they were somewhere else using the HTC Vive that I think really supported that positive result that we got from our study. And that, I think, is... And like I said, the limitation with that was around the the cables that you needed, and also the sensors you needed to set up in the room, and the fact you needed a piece of expensive computer attached to it. I think, as you can see in one of these video clips, you can see there's a computer in the background. Now with the Oculus Quest, there's none of that stuff. So it's kind of solved a lot of the issues we had by that device becoming available. And now I really think that the Quest offers just about everything we need now in this space. It's fairly affordable. It's very accessible in terms of its inputs, and there's no cables. It's an all-in-one device, and it offers a level of immersion that the HTC device offers. So we really are getting a lot closer now to a viable product that can be bought, used, and deployed in schools, I think.
And just mentioning like being affordable and accessible, how much of that is influencing kind of the directions of the current research? Because I know just from discussions that I've had so far with our department here that, affordability and accessibility right now are really at the top of things, just because, we can't decide who has the means to access this technology to use it.
Yeah, and I think so. I think you're right. When we started this research, or as this research has gone on, the affordability of the devices hasn't really been at the fore, I guess, because we've just used what has been most technically available and technically advanced, and that has often been quite expensive. And as you said, now with the situation now, we find ourselves where we're wanting solutions, low cost solutions for people at home or working at distance. That question's much more come to the fore. And I think and that's why I think we proposed the use of the Google Card or I say Google Cardboard, but the cardboard device with the smartphone. I think we've offered that as a solution, and we've started exploring how devices or how software used on those devices can be really beneficially deployed at home to help things like anxiety and mindfulness for people with autism who are finding it difficult to cope with the current situation, and just to sort of help them relax and become more connected with the outside world. Using virtual reality, that's become a really interesting point. But I think you're right. There is no sort of real answer to the affordability question and accessibility question. Luckily enough, the technology companies have helped make it more accessible by making it smaller, making it more affordable, making it more accessible, with the things I've mentioned, removing cables and the need for very specialist sort of input now. So they've really helped us in a way. But I think, like I say, there's something quite interesting about using the very low-tech solutions. I think the low-tech solutions have the highest reward in terms of the affordability of them. I mean, if everybody had $400 or £300 to spend on on an Oculus Quest, then great, but they don't. So buying a $10 cardboard device and connecting it with your smartphone, I think, can provide quite a viable, or certainly from what we've seen, quite a viable alternative, certainly for the interim, and certainly for deploying at large to large sets of pupils who might be at home struggling or wanting, yearning for some sort of real life connection. I think VR can provide that window back outside potentially, and certainly, like I say, researchers in Italy are looking at how it can be used to stimulate mindfulness techniques as well, which is really interesting.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of other countries, how much is being done right now in terms of development internationally? Like I when I look up VR and autism, there's very limited kind of stuff it looks like happening in the Google search results there. But what is happening, and also, are there any kind of cultural, I don't want to say barriers, but any cultural elements as well that come into play, especially when dealing with autistic people from different cultural backgrounds?
That's a really good question. That is a really good question. That is a culture, and autism is a poorly researched area, generally speaking, I think. Now, certainly when we look at technology, as far as I'm aware, there's been no research done on connecting cultures, technology, and the affordances and the issues maybe faced by autistic individuals. That's a really good question. I think it also raises questions, doesn't it, about social inequality and about the digital divide, the haves and the haves not. And I think that's a really interesting question. But in terms of, to come back to your question around, where is this work taking place? Is it an international? Does it have an international landscape? I think you're right. There are pockets of excellence happening. So there are obviously researchers. Stanford, has a fantastic VR research unit where they've done some work with autism and anxiety, and there's researchers in California who've done some work with PTSD, with Army veterans. And there are pockets of work going on in and around Europe, actually. Italy, as I said, and Spain, there's a couple of research centres there doing some really interesting work. And actually in the UK, the UK has been identified in several international reports as being sort of a real hotbed of VR development at the moment. And in Bristol, funnily enough, in particular, we have quite a lot of interest in small startup companies happening here in and around the VR space. Who have been working with the NHS, and particularly at the moment looking about training doctors in the NHS, because again, we need to be able to train doctors quickly at distance, and VR provides a really viable way to do that. So I think the UK and the US, remain as kind of leaders in this area, but that doesn't mean that there aren't absolute pockets of excellence happening in around Europe in particular. I'm trying to think of any other particular spaces. I know Brazil and Mexico have quite, interesting sort of emergent sort of VR markets as well. And wherever you see, well, certainly from my experience, wherever you see sort of VR developing, you start to see questions coming up around autism and people with anxiety, social anxiety, people with other sort of medical conditions. And there's a lot of interest in that. But the reality is, as you said, there's not much actually happening. There's a lot of promise for it. There's a lot of talk about it. But there's only very limited, as you have found, I think, in your research, from what you're saying, only very limited A, companies, and B, researchers sort of exploring this space. And so there is a need for us to be looking at where we can seek funding to support our activities if we see it having potential in this space. But like I say, we have just been so fortunate to be able to work with, centres in Michigan when we were working there in East Lansing, and to work with schools in the UK. We find people are very welcoming to exploring this now, and that hasn't always been the case. And probably you've can probably attest as well to often working with schools and educators as researchers can be quite challenging in terms of getting access. And I think now we're seeing a lot more open doors, and people were very willing to to work and to share experiences with us, and that's really promising. And I must say that's a really promising development in this field. And like I say, huge thumbs up and thanks to the schools that we've worked with for being willing to test and to try this out and to work with us to see where the potential lies. because as I keep coming back to, it's only through engaging with these communities that we'll actually get the next layer of research questions as researchers that we really need to address.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and if for any of the universities or reps from any of the other autism departments from other universities who might be watching this, what would be your elevator pitch to really get them on board with VR and really say, like, get them to reach out to you and want to just jump right into this and help contribute to your research and help really forward this?
Well, that's a great question, actually. I don't think I've been asked that, and I'm not sure I'd have a really good, snappy, punchy sort of answer to that. But what I would say is that every autistic individual we've worked with and their sort of broader stakeholder group, has shown huge motivation to want to use and to actually use this technology. And I think if we can tap into how this can really support these individuals in having independent, meaningful, long lives, which is often, what parents and all the various caregivers have for these individuals, that in itself should be enough to want to get involved in using some of this technology. And we see really powerful stories emerging from the individuals we worked with in terms of how we saw individuals coming back into school just to engage with this technology, and that in itself is a huge positive. So like I say, if the ambition is to ensure that autistic people have fair and equal access to jobs, employment, independent lives, and this technology can play a really important role, then we should really be spearheading and supporting that endeavor. Now, I'm not sure that was an elevator pitch. I don't know if we've got to the top of the Empire State Building maybe by that time, but yeah, I think, like I say, the impact on these people's lives and the potential to open doors to services that that are often closed for them is hugely powerful, and that's why we should be doing this.
I agree. No, that's wonderfully spoken. And I'm just curious now, what is really in store in the future of this? What are in any research paper, what are the future directions of this? Where are we going
now? Well, you see, I've got a slide here which talks about, these are the general things. I think we need to continue collaborating, moving ahead. We need to, if we're going to have impact and we're going to have meaning in what we do as researchers and this tech for good sort of area, we've got to have collaboration. We've got to continue developing an evidence base for the value of this technology. The content is key. We've got the hardware now, which we didn't have a long time ago. The content and the software is really key, and we really need to develop that. And that's where this field immediately needs to go next, I think. But I think we also need to continue, and it links with the collaboration, but we need to continue involving autistic communities and the groups in this, in this field. And why wouldn't we? Which I think then kind of links to the idea of how this field can be funded and it can be scaled. So I think we need to move towards developing specific content. We need to be building the evidence base and building the evidence base in such a way that we start to get policymakers and strategists involved in this and want to take this technology on. And we provide such a compelling argument that they definitely should take this technology on. And that enables us to really see the scale to this. And I think that's the issue we've had. We've had lots of interesting work going on in piecemeal, scattergun sort of approaches. We really need to see this work scale now. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the next big challenge. And that links to content for me and the evidence that, comes with the content.
Yeah, and in terms of technology as well, you can see a lot of really interesting things happening, especially with the connectivity within VR as well, getting multiple people in VR spaces interacting and stuff like that.
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. We've currently started a group in Alt Space VR, which you're probably aware of. And so we're using that space, and we've got an autism channel, which, again, your listeners, viewers might be interested in, spearheaded by a PhD student at the University of Kent. Here in the UK, and anybody around the world, autistic individuals join that group, and there's a shared space where, as you say, it's a social space, but it's prefixed on the, they are represented by an avatar. They can use text chat, they can use audio chat, they can use different ways of communicating, and that again can be quite appealing for some of these individuals. So you're right. I think the social context, and certainly when we saw Facebook, buy Oculus and enter this space, we start to think, well, does VR now have a social dimension connected to it? And that could prove very interesting. And I think also looking at augmented reality and looking at, we saw Google Glasses come on the market a while ago, and some interesting work done there that seemed to go away. It's coming back again. And augmented reality, and the Microsoft devices around, with AR as well. I think there's some opportunities with obviously those technologies moving ahead as well. I don't think this is just VR. I think there's those range of different immersive technologies which hold fruitful, beneficial opportunities for researchers to work with autistic communities and to see how these technologies can really have an educational, social impact.
Mm-hmm. Well, that was wonderful. And do you have any other things that you'd like to add? Any announcements or events or anything like that people should keep an eye out for?
Not really, I don't think. That's very kind of you. No, I mean, people who are engaged in this space probably are aware of the sort of spaces that they can go to, but no, there is no real one source. That brings another limitation. Actually, there's no real one sort of home for a lot of this stuff. But no, at this point, no announcements at the moment. But that doesn't mean there won't be some imminent, should I say? But yeah, at the moment, nothing. Yeah.
Are there any plans in the works for like a comprehensive body of VR and autism? Because I know I saw your website there, and I thought like that could be a space where we could really bring people together and have something, like just have that sort of solid core community, a place of gathering, a place of knowing more about it and all that kind of stuff. But is there something like that in the works right now? Any plans for?
No, nothing in the plans. Well, I think, yes, you're right. I think there are, as I say, we're looking to establish a research group, and with a research group comes those sort of presence, web-based presence and social media-based presence. But obviously, I'm connectable via social media. The Twitter handler down here. So, I think Twitter is actually quite an interesting space for some conversations and dialogue around here. But as you said, my web space is somewhere where there's some of the work that I've been doing and some links to other work off of that. That's just one resource, a fairly limited resource, I would suggest at the moment. But research centres are in discussions, and I think with them that that will bring a resource. But if I think of anything in the meantime, can I send it over to you?
Definitely, yeah.
Yeah.
For sure. No, and I can put some of these links in the description as well, so people can contact you and ask any further questions they might have, and hopefully continue developing this. And
I would very much welcome that, and yeah, please do make that point that I'm very interested in both being contacted by people who have either ideas or ways that this field could be moved forward, and particularly from autistic communities themselves and other services who can see potential for this type of technology. So please do. I'm very open to conversations and meeting new people and looking and discussing at what the future of this area can really hold.
Wonderful. And I look forward to seeing what unfolds here, because there's so much potential, and I see so many wonderful things happening both here on campus and also with what you're doing there as well. It's just giving opportunities where there were none before, and really helping people. Like you were saying, 13% of autistic people in the workforce, that's ridiculous. Shouldn't be the way it is.
Yeah, and I think, of course, there are, the tides are changing. Technology companies have tapped into the potential of people with autism, as they have a very sort of, ability to tap into computer code, in just as one sort of example. And so I think that is changing, but it's not changing fast enough. And there is quite a worrying picture for autistic people still, in terms of, that independence and, achieving employment. And I think, technology certainly provides a very helpful bridge for that. And VR is a very good opportunity for exploring some of that now and in the future.
Wonderful. All right, well, thank you so much for joining me for this discussion. And in the future here, like I said, we're going to be talking with some of these VR companies who are working with autistic people, and we'll hopefully in the future be able to have another great discussion with you as well, Nigel. And really, I'm just excited. I think this is such an amazing field and such a really cool thing.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks for your time. I really appreciate your reaching out and, like you say, wanting to sort of put this sort of center really, and have a conversation about it. And as you say, folding in the perspectives of other industries who can support the scalability of this. And I think it's really important to connect the research, the industries and the individuals themselves. And you're doing that here, which is fantastic.
Thank you. All right. Well, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day here, and we'll stay in touch.